In a quiet neighborhood, what starts as a routine day takes a shocking turn when an overzealous officer pulls over a fellow cop, a black female officer, on her way to work. But this isn't your typical traffic stop. From the moment he approaches her car, his tone is hostile, his assumptions clear. She stays calm, identifying herself as law enforcement, but instead of de-escalating, the situation spirals. The officer's behavior raises eyebrows, and bystanders start recording, sensing something isn't right. As tensions rise, an unexpected twist changes everything. Who is truly in the wrong here? What will happen when the truth comes out? This story highlights more than just a clash between two officers. It reveals deeper issues about bias, respect, and accountability. Stay tuned, because what unfolds next will leave you questioning everything. You don't want to miss this eye-opening story. The bystanders' murmurs grow louder as the officer continues to question her, his voice sharp and filled with suspicion. She calmly explains she's running late for her shift and presents her badge, but he barely glances at it, his focus unwavering. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," he demands, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Confused and frustrated, she complies, her hands visible at all times. The tension is palpable, and the crowd around them begins to grow. Whispers ripple through the small group of onlookers. Some recognize her. She's a respected officer in the community, known for her fairness and dedication. But why is she being treated like a criminal? One bystander hesitates, then finally speaks up. "She's one of us. What's going on here?" The officer snaps back, doubling down on his authority. Something doesn't add up. As the confrontation escalates, the air feels heavy with questions no one can yet answer. The black female officer stands beside her car, her composure unshaken despite the growing tension. The officer questioning her seems determined to find something, anything, to justify his actions. As she calmly reminds him of her rights and her role in law enforcement, his dismissive attitude becomes even more apparent. "I don't care who you say you are," he says sharply. "This is my stop, and I'll handle it my way." Meanwhile, the bystanders grow increasingly uneasy. Some pull out their phones to record, knowing this encounter feels wrong. Among them is a young woman live-streaming the scene, her voice trembling as she narrates what's happening. "This doesn't make sense. Why is he treating her like this?" she says to her viewers. As the tension escalates, another police car pulls up, and a senior officer steps out. The crowd watches anxiously, wondering if this will de-escalate or make things worse. The senior officer's reaction, however, adds an unexpected twist, leaving everyone stunned and questioning what's really going on. The senior officer steps out of the car, his expression unreadable as he approaches the scene. The tension in the air is almost unbearable. The female officer stands her ground, her calm demeanor masking the frustration building inside her. The crowd grows silent, waiting to see what will happen next. The senior officer looks at the black female officer, then at the cop who initiated the stop. His voice is firm but measured as he asks, "What's going on here?" The younger officer immediately starts explaining, painting the situation as routine. But the senior officer's expression changes subtly as he listens, his eyes narrowing. He turns to the female officer and asks her to explain her side. She recounts the events, her voice steady, but it's clear she's holding back a mix of anger and disbelief. The senior officer pauses, then glances toward the growing crowd and the phone's recording every word. "Let's handle this professionally," he says. But just as it seems the situation might cool down, the younger officer interrupts, doubling down on his accusations and insisting there's more to investigate. The crowd begins to stir again, their unease turning into quiet outrage. A young man in the group speaks up, his voice firm. "Why are you still pushing this? She's done nothing wrong." The senior officer raises a hand to quiet the crowd, but the tension among the officers is now undeniable. Just as it seems the situation can't get any more intense, the senior officer steps closer to the younger one, his tone shifting to something colder. "We need to talk. Now." What he says next will change everything, and the crowd waits with bated breath, cameras rolling, as the moment unfolds. The senior officer pulls the younger one aside, their voices hushed but intense as the crowd strains to hear. The female officer watches closely, her instincts telling her that something bigger is at play. The younger cop looks flustered, his defensive posture speaking volumes. Finally, the senior officer turns back toward the group, his expression unreadable. "Stay right here," he tells the younger cop before walking toward the female officer. Before he can speak, a new voice cuts through the tension. A bystander steps forward, holding their phone up. "Officer, you need to see this," they say. Confused murmurs ripple through the crowd as the person begins playing a video they captured earlier. The footage shows the younger cop parked on the side of the road, seemingly waiting, before suddenly pulling out to follow the female officer's car. It's clear now, this wasn't just a routine stop. The crowd reacts, their suspicion turning into outrage as the implications sink in. The senior officer watches the video, his jaw tightening. He glances back at the younger officer, who now looks visibly nervous. The female officer takes a deep breath, her calm exterior starting to crack as she realizes this wasn't about a traffic violation, it was personal. The crowd grows restless, demanding answers. The senior officer steps forward, raising his hands to calm them. But before he can address the situation, the younger cop suddenly moves toward his car. "Where are you going?" the senior officer demands, his voice sharp. The younger officer hesitates, his eyes darting between the crowd and his superior. The female officer steps forward, her voice steady but firm. "What are you hiding?" she asks, and the question hangs in the air, heavy with implications. The younger officer freezes, his hand hovering over the car door as all eyes lock on him. The senior officer's voice cuts through the tense silence. "Step away from the vehicle. Now." The younger cop hesitates, his face pale, but eventually steps back. The senior officer motions to the female officer, silently asking for her permission to inspect the car. She nods, her expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The senior officer opens the door, and after a moment of searching, he pulls out a clipboard from the passenger seat. He flips through the pages, and his expression hardens as he reads. "Care to explain this?" he says, holding up what looks like a printed report. The younger cop stammers. It's nothing," but the senior officer isn't buying it. The female officer steps closer, her heart pounding as she peers at the document. It's a list of vehicles and names, hers included, with what appear to be notes about where and when each car was spotted. It becomes clear, this wasn't a random stop. He'd been keeping track of her movements, waiting for the right moment to confront her. The crowd gasps as the truth unfolds, and the female officer finally breaks her silence. "You've been targeting me," she says, her voice steady despite the shock. "Why?" The younger officer, cornered and panicked, blurts out something that shocks everyone. "You think you're better than the rest of us, acting like you're above the law just because you're a cop." His words hang in the air, dripping with resentment. The senior officer shakes his head, his disappointment clear. "This isn't just misconduct, it's harassment. You're done here." As the younger cop is escorted to another patrol car, the female officer takes a deep breath, feeling both relief and anger. But just as she begins to process what happened, the senior officer quietly hands her the clipboard. "There's more," he says grimly. Flipping through the pages, she realizes her name isn't the only one on the list. There are others, officers and civilians, who might have been targets too. The crowd watches as she looks up, her expression shifting from shock to determination. This wasn't just about her. The story wasn't over yet. She knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring about what they had just witnessed, the female officer stood quietly, clutching the clipboard. She knew the fight wasn't over, but now, with the truth out in the open, there was a chance to make things right. Not just for herself, but for others who might have been targeted. The senior officer offered a brief nod of support before walking to his car, leaving her with a choice: to let it go, or to push forward. Later that evening, she filed a formal complaint, determined to expose the wrongdoing and hold the system accountable. The incident sparked an internal investigation, uncovering patterns that couldn't be ignored. Her courage inspired others to come forward, bringing long overdue change. As she reflected on the day, she realized something important. Standing up wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And sometimes, justice begins with a single voice refusing to stay silent.